Eric received his Bachelor of Architecture and Masters of Architecture from Cornell University in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, and went on to work for the offices of Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, as well as Cohn, Peterson, Fox, before establishing his own firm in 2005 with his partner, Mi-Jing Yoon. Together, Höweler and Yoon Architecture has received numerous awards, and I've typed them because there's too many for me to remember, including a Progressive Architecture Award, the Design Vanguard Award from Architectural Record, Emerging Voices from the Architecture League of New York, as well as several national and local AIA awards. In addition, their work has been exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum in New York, the Vitra Design Museum in Germany, the National Art Center in Japan, and the Venice Architecture Biennale. As if that wasn't enough, Eric is also an associate professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design in his spare time. And while all of that is sort of impressive, right? It seems like he is busy. What I'll remember him for after this visit is that he's the first person that I'm aware of in the last 9 years of running the lecture series here who has traveled from Boston to Dubai and back in 48 hours. He arrived this morning at 8 o'clock in the morning and is leaving tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock in the morning, all right? All to come and share his work with us. So before he passes out from jet lag, please help me welcome Eric Höweler.
Is the mic on? Can you hear me okay? Seems like it is. Is it? In the back? Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, so is that good? Okay. So the title of the talk is called Signal to Noise, and it's a talk that we've been sort of experimenting with. It's the title of a book that we're working on, and the book sort of tries to take the temperature of the age and show the kind of current sort of projects that we're working on in the context of this sort of particular moment. And so for us, signal to noise is a kind of question about what is the larger sort of cultural backdrop that we're working in. This is the age of the kind of superabundance of communication, a superabundance of information, and that's kind of the noise part. And for us, design in this context is how do we sort of communicate something? How do we express an idea in the context of all this noise? And so this term, signal to noise, borrowed from communication theory, makes us super aware of like who is the audience for design, who is the public, who's listening, who's receiving, and is that signal getting through? And so for us, the question is always a question of what is the role of technology in design culture, in culture at large in general? How do devices affect our design work, our ability to make experiences? And in the context of this sort of device dependency, where everything sort of disappears in a kind of cloud of noise. We like to argue that architecture is a form of mass media. It's a very old form of mass media, but it does communicate at great distances to many people. And you could say that the Gothic cathedral might have been understood as a kind of broadcast, a kind of architecture of persuasion. And at this moment, this was state-of-the-art in terms of structure, state-of-the-art in terms of glass fabrication, state-of-the-art in terms of coloration, and the effects that Gothic architecture produced created a kind of user experience, UX, of complete sort of persuasion, that you might sort of be enthralled by the quality of light and the kind of attenuated structure and the sight and the sounds and the smells in a Gothic cathedral would sort of create that fully immersive environment. And so how do we think about architecture as an immersive environment? How do we design immersive environments today? And I want to sort of go back for a moment to Paris, the 20th century, the kind of invention of a kind of metropolitan subject, the flaneur, the dandy, the person who just sort of walked the streets of Paris in this new sort of public realm, which was quickly sort of codified by different kinds of social behaviors. How do you tip your hat? How do you greet people on the street as you're strolling down the boulevard? And someone that we like to refer to as Walter Benjamin, the German philosopher who published a series of essays about the arcades. He was sort of someone who was enthralled by the sort of newly emerging sort of metropolis and the new public realm and the kind of superabundance of signals and signs and commercial products. And he sort of theorized the role of the flaneur. The flaneur is someone who sort of enjoys the city, who sort of immerses himself in the city, takes in the kind of pleasures, the visual pleasures of window shopping and seeing everybody. And Walter Benjamin has sort of famously defined architecture as different from art in that art is always experienced in a state of concentration, sort of framed by the gallery, by the museum, by the institution. And architecture has to jostle with all the kind of commercial confusion of the city. And so he says architecture is experienced in a state of distraction. And so I try to imagine Walter Benjamin's dandy here, or his flaneur, and I try to think, look, what would he think of Times Square? You know, how would he sort of experience this sort of superabundant communication? And so I like to put Benjamin's flaneur back in Times Square and imagine if it was distracting then, how might it be sort of overwhelming today? But for us, this is our sort of cultural context. And how do we use these ideas of attention and distraction, concentration, to think about architecture, hopefully in productive ways? We're not the first people to talk about architecture as media, architecture as broadcast. Robert Venturi designed a billboard building, thinking about the role that architecture plays as a sign, as a billboard. Architecture today, you could say, with computer-controlled lighting, is sort of signaling constantly. It's telling us something, and I think you don't have to look far to see a kind of superabundance of signals and signs, broadcasts, and sort of color-coded signification. This was the day that Prince died. All these buildings turned purple. And everyone said, oh, that's purple rain. Turns out it was also the Queen's birthday. And so our signals got mixed, and we thought they were celebrating Prince, but they're really celebrating the Queen. And so the thing about communication is that there's no guarantee that what you send will be received or interpreted. But I do think there is a kind of paradigm shift where every piece of architecture is now a kind of billboard. This is the ICC building in Hong Kong, which is a 118-story illuminated sign. I'm a big fan of science fiction. This movie, Blade Runner, sort of imagined a cityscape sort of drenched in images where billboards were sort of addressing you, and architecture sort of disappeared into this sort of technological backdrop. And so this sort of science fiction vision from the 80s has become a kind of reality where architecture sort of functions as a kind of interface or a screen, whether it's at your sort of display or sort of on your facade. We can think about architecture as a kind of interface. And what does that mean? That means that every interaction is mediated by your device. You cannot see an event without pulling out your phone and photographing it and videoing it and posting it and sharing it. What does that mean for us as cultural producers? If everything that we design is already sort of Instagrammed and broadcast. We're also big fans of the public realm. We think that the public realm is something that's not just leftover space. It needs to be designed. And there's something that happens in the public realm that is spontaneous and serendipitous, maybe wanted or unwanted. Things happen in public that are unscripted. And I think that's something to keep in mind. And so how does architecture sort of function to enable this kind of formation of a public and the role that the public realm plays in the production of politics and the production of a kind of a public that recognizes itself as a public with power, and power to protest, power to advance an ideal, power to resist. And I mentioned a little bit this question of public spaces being codified, both implicitly and explicitly, what you can and cannot do in public, something that we think about. And one of our first projects, I will show you, has to do with the kind of implicit rules of public space and private space, right? When is someone standing too close? And so my wife was teaching at MIT, and she designed this dress. It's called the defensible dress. It was something that she designed for a class at MIT in the Media Lab called How to Make Almost Anything. And she said, when I'm on the subway, people stand too close to me. And so I want something that will keep them back. And so she designed a microcontroller with a passive infrared sensor. And there's some shape memory alloy in those quills. And so when you get too close, the quills have an electrical charge. The charge contracts the tendon, and it lifts the quill up to create the kind of porcupine effect. This was not a piece of fashion. This was a piece of concept clothing. But we argued this is architecture because it's about space. It's about private space and personal space and public space. And so we started our practice designing projects like this. This was a media installation we did for the Athens Olympics in 2004. It consisted of fiber optics, microcontrollers, LED lights, sensors, outdoor speakers. And our thought was, if you walk into a field of lights, could the field of lights sort of respond to you? Could it trace your passage of time? Could it mask the sound of the city with white noise? And so this was 2004. We thought we could make a space in the city or a place with sound and light. And so this was an experiment. Could we create a field that would sort of follow you? And we won this competition. We actually fabricated everything. We shipped it to Athens. We installed it. Here we're sort of watching people go from left to right as they walk across this field. And we thought this was really exciting, that architecture could be made without material. That media and light was just as a material as wood and stone and metal. And so this was our sort of first experiment with this sort of media space, this kind of immersive environment, responsive environment. What we learned very quickly is that people went in there and then they refused to leave because they were so enthralled by what was happening. They were trying to figure it out. And so behavior is unlike building because behavior is sort of, to some extent, unpredictable. Human nature is such that we'll try to figure it out. We'll try to, we'll stick around and we'll try to figure it out, or we'll invent a game to play with it. But this was eye-opening for us, starting a practice in 2004, realizing that this could be an architecture. This could contain within it all the intelligence to sort of produce a dynamic field that would invite people to linger, invite people to stay, to sort of run through it, to play. And the sense of play in the city was something that we thought we could make an architecture out of. I also want to show you a project we did here in Dubai, which I don't typically show, but since I'm here, I'll mention it. A few years ago, we did a proposal. We call it sort of listening to nature. And we said maybe we could take bird songs of birds in the region and sort of play them back in an interactive way. We were also interested in the idea of a kind of surround sound speakers. And if we could network speakers, we could create the illusion that there was a bird flying around your head. And so we built this piece. It's actually in the Dubai Mall. Maybe you've seen it. But the idea was to create a responsive environment that had a kind of intelligence to it. And so it's touch sensitive, and all the speakers are networked. So it produces the illusion that there's sort of birds flying around you. And it has a number of different effects. So you can stroke it. You can sort of throw it. Throw the light up. And if you throw the light up, the bird assigned to that pole will create ground sound. Interactive public art, we thought that we could produce different kinds of real-time sound mixing. So real bird songs, sort of processed bird songs, and then completely synthetic bird songs. So depending on where you touch it, you get this sort of real-time sort of playback as a kind of instrument, a kind of spatial instrument. We also fabricated this ourselves, and so I couldn't help but notice we've got great facilities here, lots of things to make, and we love making things. So we made the physical components, we made the electronic components, the kind of touch sensing through this clear, sensitive film. We developed the boards with our fabricators, design the speakers, the heat sinks, the LEDs, the whole thing. And then we shipped it here and installed it in the Dubai Mall. As part of our kind of, how do we make architecture out of sound and light? This was kind of one of the last projects we did in that vein. But shifting gears to like materials, like brick and steel, we've been working in different parts of the world, and sometimes it's interesting to work in a different part of the world where someone says, hey, we want you to design a visitor center for Site G. The only two conditions, it has to have a slope roof and it has to have a kind of courtyard structure. So that's fine, we can do that. A Chinese courtyard house, we sort of know the type, we can interpret that in a modern way and produce a new architecture. So as good students, we sort of study the frame and we recognize that there is a kind of pavilion that's a figure, and then there's a kind of enclosure that's the frame, and this architecture is sort of flickering between figure and field. We thought we could interpret the kind of section to produce a sloped roof, a sloped wall, and this was our version of the courtyard house. We presented this to the owner. We almost got fired like right away. He really did not like it, and he didn't like any of them. He didn't like any of the architects. He sent us all home and said we didn't pass, and he didn't pay us. And then he sent us to look at the Chinese architecture, look at the gardens, and he said, I need more Chinese feeling. And I said, what's Chinese feeling? He said, go and look and see, and come back and design it again. So I went to Suzhou, and I went to the Erme Mountains, and I climbed up this mountain before sunrise, and I stood on this hill looking out at this temple, and my Chinese colleague said, look over there, that foggy, that stuff, that's Chinese feeling, you know. You need to make an architecture out of that, you know. And you can't really draw it, and you can't script it, and you can't really photograph it, but it's got to evoke that sort of sense of place, and that's hard to describe. So we went back to the drawing board and revisited our courtyard house. We sort of drew the drawings, we developed facades, we looked at windows, we introduced more sloping roofs, and then we sent these drawings out to the client, our details, and then we didn't hear from them for about 9 months. It was dead silence. And we thought, okay, what's happening? 9 months pass, an email comes in and says, good news, the project is starting again. We've changed the site, and we've changed the program, and we'd like to mirror your plan, if that's okay. So it's now a restaurant, it's on a different site, your plan's been mirrored, and it's under construction. So how quickly can you send us your new drawings? And sure enough, we went and they were building. They had built the basement already, and they were just asking for more detail about the structure. So this was our old plan, this is our site, this is the new site, this is the mirrored plan, and then we sort of shoved it in there. But we sort of made it fit a little better, adjusted some of the angles, because the site has a number of angles to sort of make it work. And so the plan still works. Oh, and they changed it again to an exhibition hall before we finished. So that's like building in China. Sent a lot of models back and forth, tried to coordinate the structure. Sure enough, they built it pretty much like our drawings, more or less, I say. Not less is more or less. And then they said, well, let's build a facade, and how would you like the facade made? We had drawn it as this sort of gray brick, and the windows had been sort of amplified by these sort of frames, these surrounds that were made out of Corten steel. They did build it very close to what we had drawn. The Chinese brick, this kind of gray brick that you see everywhere. The one idea we had was maybe the brick has a specific orientation, so that you could imagine that it has a compass in it, and it's always north, south, east, west. And so we drew these drawings where we said, if the wall is east-west, it'll be smooth, but if it's just a little bit off, it'll have that angle. And that was a simple rule that anybody could understand. Any mason could put the brick in place, just knowing that it's always sort of holding its cardinal orientation. And what it did with this one or two sets of drawings, it produced enough sort of rule-based material that the masons could set up the whole building. They could have a flat wall transitioning to an oblique wall, and an oblique wall transitioning to an oblique wall. And so this simple rule that we realized we could do in China because they were setting these bricks by hand, and labor was inexpensive, and they were willing to do it. And so at the end of the day, the client said, this building gives me that Chinese feeling, and I'm not sure what it is. Is it the material? Is it the orientation? Is it the bamboo? Is it the combination of things? But he recognized something in this project that spoke to him. And for him, it was Chinese enough. For us, it was contemporary enough. And we somehow found some middle ground between a kind of idea about a contemporary architecture and his desire for some site specificity. And so when we practice globally, we sometimes have to keep in mind that we don't know exactly what it's going to look like when we're done, because it's somehow resonating with that place. And I think as you walk around this building, those bricks, they start to orient you, and you start to realize, well, oh, I must be on the east-west alignment here. And I have to believe that the texture of the building helps you navigate the space that you're in, and maybe helps you sort of ground yourself or locate yourself sort of within the context of the site. Shifting gears a little bit, a few years ago we were asked to design a memorial for a police officer. And this was, Boston had a kind of terrorist attack. There was an explosion at the marathon finish line, and a police officer was killed. And this was an MIT police officer. And so immediately there was a kind of spontaneous memorial to this police officer, because MIT had never lost an officer before. They'd never had an act of terrorism before. And so nobody knew what to do. And they asked if we would design a memorial for this police officer. But they asked, what is a memorial? What is a memorial today? What is the status of memory? And we thought, that's a great question, because, we all have a cell phone in our pocket, and if we need to know something, we can just call it up on our smartphone. So memorials and monuments, whether they were sort of men on horses, or something just flickering across a screen. This is a Department of Transportation sign that is broadcasting a signal about fallen heroes and injured. I think this was for a fireman that died. So we can use technology to enhance our memory. Maybe it doesn't replace memory. This doesn't replace the man on the horse. But it just opened up an opportunity for us to think about, how do we design a memorial in a different way that is not the man on the horse and is not the sort of flickering image on your screen. In the response to the terrorist attacks, a lot of people talked about MIT strong or Boston strong, and the MIT logo is mens et manus, which is hand in mind, which is pretty good. And they added fortis, and we said maybe the memorial should talk about strength. But what is strength? And what is structure? And what is strong about structure? What is strong about community? Maybe it's about balance and equilibrium. Maybe we can think about that in the context of this memorial. So this is a site where Sean Collier was killed, where the X is. On the bottom is the Frank Gehry building. On the right is the Cancer Research Building. We got lots of proposals. People said, I want to have a flag. I want to have a body of water. I want to have a tree. And the family said, I would like to have a boulder. And so we got all these requests for, how do we remember Sean Collier? With a boulder, with a flag. And we thought about it, and we said, well, and we could find something that means different things to different people. And that's the important thing about broadcast, is that you cannot guarantee the signal will be decoded as you imagine. So we said, what if there's a kind of figure? Maybe it's a kind of abstract figure, and maybe we intersect that figure with another figure, like the boulder that they asked for. And maybe we pull the boulder out of that figure, and then we just get this sort of figure, the void left by the boulder. So we don't give them a boulder, we give them the sort of conspicuous absence of a boulder as it's sort of subtracted from another figure. And then for some people, we show them this open hand, this idea of MIT being this hand in mind. And we said, a lot of people in the States were sort of saying, we can't have an open society anymore. We have to somehow sort of close our hand or clench our fist. And we said, no, it's important to have the hand open, because that's what makes MIT strong. That's what makes America strong. And maybe we could sort of think about the hand as as another metaphor, as this hand that works, the hand that is stable, the hand that sort of starts to span. And so we developed this idea of this sort of five-legged figure that contains 5 rooms, but also together they make one room in the middle. And that's the sort of missing boulder, that's the sort of absent figure. And then it's also a kind of viewing device. So as you sort of walk around it, you sort of get sort of directed at certain views. There's the Frank Gehry building in the back. And this sort of video just shows, as you sort of walk through it, that you sort of look at this special boulder that's placed just where the car used to be. So you get that sort of frame view, and then you sort of come out of it. We also thought it would be really great if we could make it out of solid stone, real solid material. And we have a colleague at MIT who did his dissertation on vaults and Aztec or Inca masonry. His name is John Oxendorf, and he's like, yeah, we can make it out of stone. And in fact, what you've designed is an arch, and an arch is a great, structural system. Super stable. It relies on all the parts. It produces equilibrium and strength through that kind of equilibrium. So with John, we sort of talked about maybe we sort of bring back a kind of solid masonry technology. Maybe we can build a contemporary arch as a sort of irregular figure. And we proposed this to MIT, and they bought into this idea that building a stone arch today wasn't crazy, that we could use sophisticated computer-controlled technology to fabricate these stone blocks with the precision that's required, and we could structure it in a way that was using only compression, just like the Romans or like the Incas. And so we had 4 different structural engineers sort of arguing about how to design this monument. They pointed out that it's very deflection sensitive, and that any sort of misalignment would create, a 1 millimeter slip in this orientation would create a 6 millimeter slip in this orientation, and we wanted to avoid that. It's a very horizontal arch. And so it sort of necessitated a kind of precision in fabrication that did not allow for any fabrication error. So we designed the blocks as you would, as a kind of pure compression system. And every block thrusts to the next block and thrusts to the next block. We used old-fashioned hand calculation, but we also developed sort of computer scripts to sort of calculate the vectors of this thrust. And then we procured the blocks, where we went to the quarry, we sort of picked the blocks. We said, yep, does it fit in that block? Yeah, I'll take it, I'll buy it, I'll send it to the fabrication facility. And we're a fantastic fabricator. It was not to using the most advanced stone cutting. We learned a lot. Before this, we'd never built anything out of solid stone. We learned about CNC stone cutting. We learned about different processes to get the different cuts. We also learned that as the blade cuts the stone is wearing away, but the blade is also wearing away. So confidence in our digital tools that we think, I'll just tell the computer to cut it, and then it'll sort of spit out the thing at the end. It turns out that we think the blade is a 3-meter blade, but every time it cuts it, it gets a little smaller. So the diameter of the blade is reduced from 6 to 7. That sort of blew my mind, because I said, well, I think I know where the blade is in the world. The blade is sort of diminishing, then I don't know what kind of shape the stone is. So that kind of question about calibration and precision, especially with precision, especially in the digital age, I tempered by this material, which is stone, resistant thing, a kind of physical, brute, resistant material. That error, but in fact it's material. So I can explain about precision in the digital age needs to be tempered by recognition that material has built into it a kind of resistance. You can't just wish away the digital. So through this process, I think we learned a lot about stone, but we also learned some different ideas about precision and digital tools. So this was fabricated in Wisconsin. Each block was delivered to site, and they arrived on site like this. We picked a granite that had a vein in it so we could sort of see the vein, turn the corner, and recognize that it's a three-dimensional thing, that it's not just a veneer. The blocks are set in place. That's the keystone. And I always thought keystones came last, right? That's like what you think of, boop, you put the keystone in last. But in this case, the keystone came first. And then we built the buttresses out. And what that did is it allowed us to shed any tolerance that we had built up to the perimeter. And we could, and we could shed it towards to the ends of the legs. And so this is the memorial at MIT under construction, the keystone and the ring stones. You see the legs starting to form. We built it during the winter of the most snowfall ever recorded in Boston. We had about 102 inches of snow that winter. But we couldn't help it. We had to build it because it had to be done by the anniversary of this attack. So here's the scaffolding propping up the stone. The buttresses come in. And at the very last minute, we had to sort of pull the scaffolding out. But because it's MIT, they turned it into a research project, and they said, well, force is something that you can't see, right? You cannot see the kind of force going through the columns, right? How do you make force visible? And in a way, this memorial does it, but the scaffolding sort of conceals the fact that it's taking load, right? And we can only register the load on these scales. And so they instrumented the whole memorial. As they removed the scaffolding from the center, they watched the load come off the scale underneath it, but transfer it to the perimeter. And so we could see in real time all the scales on the perimeter sort of starting to absorb the load. And so we couldn't see the force, but we could measure the kind of the beginning of arching, you know. And so we got really excited about monitoring the load sort of shifting from the center to the perimeter. And the day that we took the scaffolding out was this incredible day where we sort of first saw this kind of hollowed out space, this conspicuous void of the boulder that's missing. And this is the crew that sort of built it. And so the kind of the memorial is about sort of creating this place on campus, which becomes part of the everyday. You walk by it, you sort of walk through it. You might not think about it. It has a kind of peculiar acoustic property where when you walk through it, you can hear a different kind of echo. And sometimes when you walk by, the exterior is flamed, so it's got a kind of rough texture, but the inside is smooth and it's polished. And sometimes water sort of condenses on the inside surface because it's smooth. And sometimes it feels like the inside is crying, but the outside is dry. So it's working on so many levels to create something special, something surprising. When you walk by, you can almost feel like there's something missing here. And you can sort of feel the kind of presence of some sort of absence there. And I like that it sort of combines like the most sophisticated computer-controlled technology we could find with something so ancient and so old that we sort of forgot about it. We didn't know how to build a stone arch anymore. And now we do. And some people see a hand, and some people see a star, and some people see a constellation of lights that sort of mirrors the way the sky was the night that he was killed. But I think to design a memorial today, you have to sort of build in all these different readings, and then people still come to me and say, you know, I don't see the hand, but I see something else. And I think this question of architecture that's sort of signaling something, it's sending a message, it's being interpreted, and different people interpret it differently. I think that's so important as architecture, especially in context where different people are reading architecture. It's not like we can decode it like the kind of classical architecture of the past. We're in a completely global society. Everybody's reading things differently. And we have to think about that reception as well as the kind of broadcast that we're sending out. I'm going to take a little pause for a sip. Okay. A couple years ago, we won a competition to do a piece of sculpture in public in Phoenix. And we said, how do we make a place in Phoenix? Maybe we should think about shade. And we had noticed in Mexico City, there's a flag, and then look where the people are. They're like lined up in the shadow of the flagpole. And as the day goes on, the flag, you know, the shadow moves around, and everyone moves with it. So they're just like. And so we thought, how do we make place? In a place that's super hot, we have to make shade. We have to make shadows. And so we began this project by thinking about, let's make interesting shadows. Let's make a shadow maker. So we sort of folded paper and we sort of came up with some forms, and we said, it's interesting to let light come through in some places to create a pattern, but also to let air move through it. And so how do we think about a kind of private parasol or a public parasol? And how do we design a series of units that could sort of aggregate to produce a sense of public, a sense of gathering, something that allows it to proliferate, but also something that breathes, something that's oriented towards the sun. So sometimes it lets light in, sometimes it's completely open, and then sometimes it's completely opaque. You know, and so how do we think about where it is in the world? What sky is it looking at? When is the sun in that sky? And how do we sort of calibrate a kind of open, breathing structure that is selectively shading at different times of day and making a sense of place where people might gather. Having people sit outside in Phoenix is quite hard. I imagine you can relate to that. But I've been watching how people use public space here, and I did see people sitting, you know, in the shade produced by a single tree. And this idea of place-making by shade producing and shadow making, I think is a powerful way to sort of create a sense of place, a microclimate in the city, something that's just a little bit cooler, a little bit breezier than, you know, somewhere 10 feet over to the right or to the left. And this pavilion was built on the budget of a public art piece, but I think it does do a lot in the city. And at nighttime, it sort of uses the power that it generates during the daytime to sort of broadcast back out a kind of lighting effect. So a kind of public art piece that creates a sense of place. Starting with the defensible dress and white noise, white light, we've been asked to do a number of public art projects or kind of place-making projects. Everybody wants to activate public space, and they think technology can help us do that. So a couple years ago, we designed these swings, and it was meant to be temporary, a temporary public space enhancement. So we gave the swings a little brain, and so when the swing tilts, it turns pink. And when it's still, it's white. But it goes from blue to pink. Just give you a little bit of feedback. So if you need any feedback to swing, pink would sort of make it more. Enjoyed.
I'm not getting off this thing.
Grown people refuse to get off this thing. They're having so much fun. I thought, oh, this is good to play, but the grown-ups are the ones that and it was incredibly popular. Everybody was enjoying. And I just wanted to show you just the process. Like, we started with a simple idea, like this model, you know, and then we sort of went to our shop and we CNC milled some plastic sheets. We used some Arduino microcontrollers, designed the brains, designed the behavior. So, like when it tilts, it turns pink. We fabricated it ourselves in our shop, and then we found a place that could do this sort of rotomolding. And so rotomolding is like you pour in the plastic, you sort of close it, you heat it up, and then you sort of spin it until all the surfaces are coated with this plastic. And then after 12 minutes, you pop out a kind of monolithic piece that has no joints, but is only 1/8 of an inch thick, and it's hollow on the inside. And so we enjoy finding fabricators that use different techniques, different fabrication techniques. And so over the years, we've sort of improved from the sort of flat, welded plastic sheets to these now fully molded swing pieces. The first one we installed. Second year, we put on some PVs to take it off the grid, and we thought, can we have pleasure and sustainability? You know, usually they say, oh, it's sustainable, don't use anything, don't use any power. And we said, well, let's send a different signal. Let's say we'll generate power, and the swings will be off the grid. And so we don't have to make these choices like no fun, you know, don't use any electricity. Let's make electricity, let's make it locally, let's consume it locally. And so we can make the kind of production of energy visible. So people can say, oh, I was swinging at the swings, and I had a lot of fun, and it was completely net zero. I didn't sort of consume any electrical power. And so we installed the PVs, and it was super popular. You know, this is so popular. When I go there, I can't get a swing. And it didn't hurt that there's a beer garden next to it, which sort of produced a different kind of effect. But we like to watch people swinging. And so remember what I said about codes and behavior, right? And so they said, can you make something that tells them what they're allowed to do? So we said, let's have more do's and don'ts. So you can swing by yourself, you can swing with two people, you can sit like this, you can ride a horse. We don't want you to swing on top. We don't want you to stand on the swing. We don't want you to push too hard, right? So we said, let's do some do's and don'ts. And people will be adults and they'll behave themselves, right? I look on Instagram just to see what crazy things people are doing, you know, and they record themselves doing them. It's amazing. You know, she says, technically I didn't break any rules. Yeah, right. The rules weren't explicit enough. It says you're not supposed to do that. But we kind of like, you know, these kind of weird things that people do to dress up. The Blue Man Group was there. That was cool. And then Delta Airlines was advertising, you know, travel the world, swing on a swing. Anyways, we had fun. And so we made a new set of rules. So we said, you know, people are doing all these crazy things. Let's update our rules. So these are yeses. We had someone propose to someone on the swings, which we thought was a first. That was great. Don't do this. This is too much. And don't do this. But, you know, no smoking, please. No shoving. You know, be gentle. Don't drink too much. You know, or enjoy responsibly, I guess is what they'd say. Don't leave luggage unattended. Don't look after your pets. Important. Don't steal our swings, please. Don't crash the swings. Take selfies. We like that. Play games. We like that. Different kinds of games. Play music. Yay. Not sure what that is. We had fun, so we just sort of sat around and said, what can we do? And how do the swings become a vehicle for sort of conveying what we want, right? We want people to have fun. We want them to fall in love. We like urban agriculture, you know, has nothing to do with the swings. And, you know, but still don't do this. And don't fight over the swings. And don't do this. And don't do this, you know. So at a certain point we said we could use a swing to sort of broadcast our values. We can encourage urban farming, renewable energy, don't be a racist, you know, all kinds of stuff. So the swing was just a vehicle to start to articulate a set of values and a set of proposals. Anyways, for the book, we're also thinking about ecology a lot, and I think it's on everyone's mind. You know, a few years ago, New York had this superstorm Sandy, which knocked out power to half of Manhattan. And I think this photograph was the first time a lot of people looked at New York and said, you know, this invincible city was knocked out by a hurricane, half of it, you know. This was a really powerful image because it showed that a city like New York is vulnerable. You know, we don't think about our city as vulnerable, but for a week, Lower Manhattan had no power. The only power that's lit up is Goldman Sachs, like right there in the middle, because they had their own generator. So I think this question of ecology and how do people understand themselves in the larger context is a kind of question that we're all thinking about. And how do we communicate that? Whether we're anxious about it, how do we sort of help people understand their own role within the environment? And so we've undertaken a set of modest projects to help people visualize their energy footprint, to help them visualize energy. And so we did a temporary project at MIT called Windscreen. And we sort of took our, you know, our laser cutter and some parts. You know, there's like $4 of parts here. And we said, maybe we'll make a more beautiful wind turbine. Wind turbines are ugly. Nobody wants them. If it was a piece of sculpture, would you want it? And so we thought, well, we can design a beautiful wind turbine. And we did a bunch of tests. And we said, you know, it doesn't need to spin super fast. It just needs to spin fast enough to light up. And I think the one on the right is the most beautiful one. And it sort of works a little bit. Not well enough. But we ended up with the one in the middle. So we said, okay, we're going to do the one in the middle. We made 400 of these. At MIT. It's so windy that when it opened, you couldn't open the door. This was designed by IMK. So we put that wind tunnel. We said we were going to display energy. So to broadcast all this abundant, clean energy, create a pattern. We called it eco-literacy. Can we teach people to read their environment using architecture, using signals? And so that was something we just did a temporary project. But a lot of people at MIT walk by and they're like, wow, that's really cool. Where's the computer that's sort of telling those lights what to do? There's no computer. It's just a micro wind turbine, and it's just sort of broadcasting where the wind is flowing. And it's flowing fastest right in the middle. Right? It's slowing down on the edges. Anyways, that's an image of a project that's really meant to show the environment to the user, to help the user read their environment. A couple years ago, we pitched the project to bring people to the Philadelphia waterfront. It's called Float Lab. And Philadelphia is an industrial city. It was sort of built on the Delaware River and the Schuylkill River. And if you look at a plan of Philadelphia, it's really the grid that sort of connects these two rivers, right? If you sort of look a little further, you notice that those rivers go up to coal country. And all the coal that was extracted in coal country was shipped down these two rivers, and it was processed just outside of Philadelphia. And so like the image of Philadelphia might be the kind of Liberty Bell and the whatever, the Declaration of Independence. But the other thing about Philadelphia, it is a petro-metropolis. It is the site of a lot of energy production. And this energy production comes at a cost. They were polluting the river. The production of, the processing of all this power produced toxicity. At some point the river caught on fire, it was so polluted. And that's a story that isn't sort of well known. The other story that's not well known is that the Schuylkill River's been remediated over time. It was the first Superfund site. This is where the federal government put a lot of money into cleaning out the pollutants in the river. And over time, they've managed to restore the river to some semblance of a kind of urban nature that has wildlife, that has fish, that has birds, that people can come and explore and learn about the urban nature in their backyard. And so we said, how can we create an installation that brings people to that urban nature in their backyard so that they can appreciate their river and see the river in the context of its history of energy refinement, and put them in a position where they're seeing the river differently, right? You've never seen the river like that. You know, you look down on it, you drive past it, but you're not in the river in this way. And so this was a proposal that we made to the city of Philadelphia. Like, let us make this thing, and we'll bring kids to do outdoor environmental classrooms. We'll do exercises to test the water quality. We'll see what's in the water if there's things living in the water. What can we do to make a kind of learning lab in the river that might offer a vantage of the river that would have been inaccessible until this time? So we sort of naively said, why don't we just make a submarine? We'll make a submersible. We'll fill it. We'll fill the ballast with water. That's how a submarine works. You basically sink it. You pump water in, and then the thing sinks. And so we designed a prototype, which we built for $50,000 in Philadelphia, and then we floated it out there. We pumped water into it, and then as the water went in, it sort of sunk into the river. Zach went in there to sort of monitor the ballast. Kate was observing the river sort of from this eye-level view. And we invited the donors to come and take a look. And the William Penn Foundation came, and they visited our prototype, and they were so impressed, they said, we'll fund your project. And they pledged $2 million to build the real float lab. So sometimes a prototype, you know, is enough to sort of convince people it's a kind of proof of concept. And so with the William Penn Foundation's money and other donations, we've partnered with Bartram's Garden, which is a botanical garden, and we're going to launch this float lab, not this summer, but next summer. And they'll host a series of outdoor learning exercises on the float lab, and they'll let the public sort of walk into the river and experience urban nature sort of from a new vantage point. So we're super excited about that. We also got a PA award for this project, so now we have to do it. Okay, the last part of this presentation, I call it feed, because I think we're constantly sort of, we're consuming feeds, social media feeds, we're broadcasting social media feeds, we're constantly doing new work. And I think it's changed the way we work. In the past, you used to wait till the magazines came and you would look at them and you would see what everyone was doing. And then you sort of went to people's websites and you said, oh, what's that project on their website? Now, we're broadcasting all our work through Instagram and Facebook. People know about our projects before they're even done, when they're just a kind of an idea. And it changes the way we work because we get feedback early on. People are like, hey, I saw that thing you're doing. Isn't that interesting? How are you doing it? Maybe you should talk to my friend who knows someone who can do that. So we're much more real time. You know, we used to be kind of messy. We're still messy. We like to make lots of things. But I think the way we work is different. And I just wanted to sort of convey that in the age of social media, in the age of digital fabrication, in the age of a kind of global practice, somehow all these things are changing the way we work. It's not business as usual. We're working in different contexts. This was a competition we did in Shanghai a few years ago. Someone said, we want 2 towers, the footprint is set, you have to design the perimeter. And we said, we've never done a residential tower before. Maybe the residential tower should be about choice and difference, and maybe every floor should have a different size unit. And so we sort of came up with this idea that the balconies would change as the unit sizes changed. And so every floor would have one more or one less number of units on the facade. And that sort of produced its own facade. It produced its own geometry. And to our surprise, it produced that sort of curvature. Like, we weren't expecting that. And that's just the kind of rule base, right? You say 4 units, 5 units, 6 units, 7 units. As you increase the number of units, you compress the module, it starts to produce that sort of curve, which surprised us. And this, I guess it's 2011, so that's a while ago. But for us, this was eye-opening. You know, we talk about computational design, we talk about rule-based design. All of a sudden, this was a rule that produced its own geometry. It produced its own image, and we were surprised by it. And we thought, I don't know if I like it. It looks like a pineapple. But we were excited about the idea that we could sort of put in place a rule, and the rule would produce its own kind of form. And so we went with the form, although we didn't win the competition. But it was a kind of incredible learning exercise for us. And so a few years later, we were approached by a developer to do a project in Boston. And we thought, like, how do we think about residential buildings? And each balcony needs to be special, and everyone wants to have their own sort of articulated point. And in the city of Boston, it's very hard to build a big building. And so they always want you to make a building that looks smaller than it is. And so all these studies were about sort of hiding the height of the tower. So we sort of broke down the scale, and we sort of played games with the stacking, and maybe it gets smaller as it goes up, or maybe it gets taller as it goes up. How do we carve it out and do something surprising? How do we make it look solid? And so we sort of worked from the kind of monolith to the kind of, we call it a coursed block. It's a block that's built up of a lot of pieces. And we ended up with something that looks a bit like a kind of fluted, broken, stacked, and shifted column with 7 units per floor. And we've been really sort of enjoying thinking about the articulation of this, fluting. And so to our first meetings with the developer, we brought these cast plaster pieces. And the developer was so taken by these physical models that they're like, we love it. We love this thing. How do we make it? And we said, we don't know, but we want to do it. And so we started with plaster, and then we sort of took it into Revit, and we've been optimizing it with contractors to figure out how many unique molds we need. And we sort of rendered it. We've been fighting with the city to let us build it in a neighborhood which is very cute, 2- and 3-story brick buildings. And then this is a 20-story tower sort of on the edge of this historic neighborhood. But we've managed to get approval from the Landmarks Commission, which is like unheard of. They said this is actually a very appropriate translation of a kind of history and craft of traditional architecture on a new type. And so that was a huge accomplishment. And so this project, we hope to break ground by the end of the year with these precast panels that we've spent a lot of energy mocking up and testing We love the way the shadows play across its face. We love that it sort of creates almost a space that you could almost stand inside of. It's a kind of welcoming gesture. And so I think all that, the kind of material and the light and the kind of texture, I think those are all things that contributed to our ability to convince the city, to convince the client to allow us to sort of build this very unusual facade. Okay. So some of the projects are moving forward, some of them are not moving forward. I'm going to show you one that's not moving forward. A few years ago, we proposed a pavilion for the expo. And we were working with Todd Mackover at the MIT Media Lab, and he was approached by Dubai 2020 to design a performance. And the idea was, how do we bring people together during the expo? How do we create a sense of empathy? And so this became the Empathy Pavilion. And what we learned is that empathy is something that can be taught, that can be learned. And so this was meant to contain a series of workshops and an experience that would take you through the pavilion in 45 minutes. You would meet with people, they would introduce you to other people, you would meet with researchers, you would participate in research, and then it would sort of culminate in a kind of musical performance that doesn't require language, but that would sort of bind people together in a newfound sense of empathy. And so this was the exterior expression of this pavilion that we presented to the Expo committee. The concept was, how do we bring people together in these settings, these interior settings? Can we script a series of experiences on the interior and a series of experiences on the exterior to sort of bring people in, train them to be empathic, and then put them back out into the world and let them interact with people differently. The other big move, of course, is self-shading, right? How do we create an environment that transitions from inside to outside through these generously sort of shaded, overhanging balconies? We took this quite far in terms of developing plans, developing the sort of narrative about the entry sequence, about the different experiences within the exhibition concepts on each level, and then the sort of super duper media immersive environment that was meant to sort of culminate this experience and then sort of put you back out into the world to sort of behave differently. But these are kind of the renderings that we produced, that we presented. We worked out the structural systems with Bureau Happel, we worked out the environmental systems with Transolar, and Atelier 1, thinking about the self-shading and how could we use the concept of shade and the concept of differential thermal contexts to sort of ease the transition from inside to outside in this proposal. So sadly, this was not accepted, but we had a lot of fun developing it, and it's something that you sort of put in your back pocket, and you're like, I'm going to keep that, because in a way this one and the memorial, they have this sort of similar language of this sort of carving and scooping, bullioning, and one is about an absence to remember, and the other is about self-shading and a kind of urban promenade. Recently we've been working in China, and someone said, can you design a hotel in Chengdu? And so we said, well, we could design a hotel in Chengdu that might have some of these similar kind of forms, and we're actually planning to build this one, which is a kind of 18-room boutique hotel that has a similar language of a kind of sculpted solid that's been eroded through these conspicuous voids to create a lobby and an urban balcony and this sort of promenade along the water that reflects the light up into the soffit. And so this one is in design development, and we hope to build it hopefully next year. I've got one more project to share. This is another part of our feed because it's very contemporary. We're working on it right now. It's under construction right now. So this is Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia campus. In the history of the American campus, Thomas Jefferson sort of set the kind of the archetypal campus. He used Palladian architecture. He defined what he calls the lawn, which is a sort of very formal quadrangle of grass. There are 10 pavilions, each of them sort of designed a little bit differently. These were designed for faculty members to sort of stay on this academical village. And the rotunda houses the library over there. this sort of pristine image of what an American campus should be is what Jefferson sort of designed. This is a picture postcard view. What we didn't know is that Jefferson built this campus with slave labor. Slavery was legal. He owned slaves. His professors owned slaves. Some of the students owned slaves. And that's not something that someone tells you when you go to University of Virginia. They tell you about Thomas Jefferson, our president, what a humanist, he had such great ideas. But they don't tell you that this architecture enabled the kind of the pristine image of the American campus while masking the labor that enabled it. And so if you go into that pavilion, there's a basement that opens up to a garden, and in the garden there was someone chopping wood, there was someone preparing food, there was someone doing all that work. This campus was built on slave labor, and it functioned based on slave labor. And if you look on the left-hand side in that red box, you see a slave, a black slave holding a white child. And so even though this image is presenting an ideal and it's masking a kind of institutionalized violence, it's somehow hinted at in that left-hand corner. The students of University of Virginia realized this. They demanded that the university acknowledge this, and they had a student competition to say, we want a memorial that acknowledges this history because nobody told us that. We had to sort of find it. And if you ask Thomas Jefferson, he's quoted as saying, follow the truth, wherever the truth may lead. And so we thought about Jefferson when we interviewed for this project. Right before we interviewed for this project, Michelle Obama got up on stage in front of the whole country and said, I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves. Oh my God, the White House was built by slaves. Most of the buildings in Washington, D.C. were built by slaves. And so all of a sudden we're starting to think about architecture not as a kind of pristine, formal, linguistic system, but we think about the labor and the material and the resources that produced it. Where do those materials come from? Who made them? Who crafted the stone? Who set the bricks? And all of a sudden, architecture started to look quite different. We had to think about questions of labor, questions of, what are ideals for a democratic society? Should those ideals be made explicit? Why is the ambiguity of Thomas Jefferson's slave ownership not something that's ever talked about? So at the same time, there was a movement in Charlottesville, Virginia. They have a statue of General Lee. General Lee was a Confederate general that led the South. This statue was not built after the war. This was built in the 1930s, I believe. So this was not something to commemorate the war. This was something that was built to intimidate African Americans in Charlottesville forever after. And so there was a movement to take the statue down. They said the Confederate history has no place in our contemporary society. Let's take it down. At the same time, a lot of people said this is our heritage. We want to sort of preserve our heritage. And so it sort of produced a kind of fiery debate. Should we remove these monuments? Which monuments are good? Which monuments are bad? Is erasure just as bad as the statue itself? And so this is a healthy debate. This is ongoing, right? But the university is planning to build a monument to recognize its role in enslaving people. About 5,000 slaves were enslaved. And so they hired us to design a memorial. We worked with the community. We listened to them. We had 6 months of meetings, understanding the history. We made a number of proposals across campus. We ended up with the proposal in the upper right, which is an 80-foot diameter bowl, a kind of earthwork. And you notice that the rotunda is an 80-foot diameter dome, right? So there's a bowl and a dome, and we thought that this might be a kind of dialogue with Jefferson's idealized architecture of the academical village, now carved into the ground and rendered as this sort of abstract figure. Maybe we could bring people to this abstract figure and they could learn about the history. Maybe we could carve the names of the slaves in the memorial. Maybe this becomes something that every year there's an event here on the day that the slaves were liberated. Maybe it becomes a kind of a living memorial. And so we sort of developed this design as a kind of earthwork where you sort of walk in, you sort of go down. We sort of learned some lessons from Mai Lin's Vietnam Memorial, which is a kind of cut in the ground. In this case, the cut sort of brings you back out. We sort of worked on this kind of battered geometry with a bench, with this wall and this other wall. We tested the proportions, and we thought maybe the wall actually has the kind of body sort of inscribed in its geometry. So from my toe to my hand, that line sort of forms the kind of architecture of the slope. And then we worked with the artist to articulate the exterior. And the community really wanted something visual. Like they thought abstraction was not the answer, that it could be too cold and too abstract and nobody would interpret it. They wouldn't know how to interpret it. So we worked with an artist named Eto Otitigbe, who's an African-American artist. And he was interested in both the scar image on the left and the kind of rough cleft stone. This is a stone from that period where slaves were working the stone and they were carving it in a very rough way. And so because the tombstones are dated, we know that this was contemporaneous with the period. And Isabella Gibbons was a slave that was actually freed, and she went on to become a teacher, and she spoke very eloquently about what it's like to be enslaved and what it's like to be free. So with those ingredients, we produced the texture of the memorial on the outside. Eto has been taking photographs of himself and translating them through a kind of scripting operation into a kind of image. And so it's something called photo VCarve, where you sort of take a raster image and it produces a toolpath. And the toolpath changes the depth and the width of the line such that it produces a kind of image in the stone. That's basically showing a series of lines. I'll play it again because it's kind of striking, but when you it's kind of striking because from certain points of view you don't see it, certain points of view you do, and that's something that we wanted to incorporate. So this is a kind of prototype of the stone. If you squint at it, you might see a kind of eyeball there, but that is the image of Isabella Gibbons' eyes sort of wrapped around the memorial. And so that's part of this, which is the kind of the image carved into the memorial. And then there's the names. And we look at the records, and slaves were property, so they were logged like property. I got 3 slaves, I bought 2 slaves, I sold 3 slaves, and so the records exist. And we have a group of historians that are going through those records and coming up with a list of names. They're also interpolating, because there's lots of things that we don't know. So we don't know how many slaves total. We think there are about 5,000. And so we thought maybe we can sort of carve 5,000 marks into this memorial. We don't know their names, but the mark is a kind of placeholder for a name. And when you do that, you see the whole interior is sort of dense with these marks. And at a certain point, I think quantities have a certain quality, and so 5,000 marks creates a kind of impression that you feel in your gut. You're like, oh my God, there's so many marks. Think about 5,000 humans enslaved by this institution. And so we wanted to create something really sort of powerful and visceral. And so the memorial will have these 5,000 marks. There'll be about 1,000 names, the names that we actually know. And just conceptually thinking, like, how do you carve into stone the name of someone you don't know? Do you carve Johnny? Do you carve unknown? Do you carve family of 3? Sometimes the record says family of 3. And so do we take that and carve it into the stone? Does that recognize their humanity more or less? Or does that sort of reproduce the structure of ownership that the records sort of manifest? These are kind of tough questions that we've been sort of grappling with. Anyways, we are working on that. This is the kind of updated memorial design. I'm going to play a short video, and then I've got a short story to sort of end the presentation.
Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water, when God's gonna trouble the water, come on and wade in the water, you gotta wade in the water, children, wade in the water, where God's gonna trouble the water. Well, now you see those children all dressed up in white. God's gonna trouble the must be the children of the Israelites. God's gonna trouble the world.
So this has been an incredibly difficult project, partially because there are all these kind of moral questions that are attached to it. We're designers, but we're also asked to sort of represent a part of history that many people don't know and many people don't want you to know. When this project was announced, the Washington Post sort of wrote about it, and they sort of pointed out that there's a kind of funny relationship between the Confederate monument and the slave memorial. And they're happening at the same time, they're in the same town. And then this summer, after we started designing it, this whole question of Confederate monuments sort of blew up. And thousands of neo-Nazis showed up in Charlottesville one summer, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." I think you saw this in the news. It was horrific to see Nazis in plain daylight in modern-day America. And we were horrified. We were horrified that these guys felt bold enough to sort of march in front of the cameras today. And I feel like a few years ago, they would do this sort of in secret, or they would do it, but now it seems like it's acceptable. And look at the building behind them. That's Thomas Jefferson's building, right? They're not marching in front of the statue of Robert E. Lee. They're standing in front of, Thomas Jefferson. And so why are they here? They're here because they know Jefferson owned slaves, and maybe they're attaching themselves to Jefferson, and the kind of leftover kind of ambivalence that the university has in Jefferson's legacy, that they haven't sort of clarified that. They haven't sort of said unequivocally, we reject that. That this was a brilliant person, but he also had flaws, and this was an incredible flaw, a kind of ethical and moral flaw. So for us, the fact that these neo-Nazis are here in front of Jefferson means that there's work to be done, that legacy hasn't been sort of addressed clearly enough. And so that ambivalence, I think, needs to be sort of corrected. A few days later, I think the students of the University of Virginia sort of gathered to say, we reject that. We don't want these guys here. We're going to come together and fight this racism, and we're going to do something about it. And so this was super powerful for us, because we were designing a memorial that's meant to sort of right wrongs from the past and sort of set the record straight. And it's just a piece of architecture. It's modest, but I think it's engaged in a sort of bigger question, a kind of moral question for the university, for American society today. Like, how do we sort of speak out against this language and this rhetoric of hate? I want to end on this slide just to say that it's so important for us to think that design is not just about style or fashion or trends. It actually has a real purpose. The design has consequences, and how we design and how we communicate is so important because it advances our values and it broadcasts those values to everybody. So with that, I just want to say that design really matters, and what you're doing is really important. How you translate your ideas and your values into the built environment, into the world, is a record of who you are, and that is really significant. So we need to take that really seriously. Okay, with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much. Sorry, that was a really heavy way to end, but I had to show this project. It's ongoing. It's under construction right now. We're so excited about it, and I just wanted to share it with you. And if you have any comments or questions, I'm happy to take them.